The Power Rangers 30th Anniversary Special Once and Always has, at long last, hit Netflix. So, as you all no doubt expected, we're gonna talk about it. Spoiler warning now, as always, so if you haven't caught the special yet, swing on over to Netflix or other sites if you have to. Times are tough, I get it. So with all that said, let's get right into it. Most of us came into this special with the understanding that having it take place in the year 2023 meant that it would, at the very least, need to acknowledge the passing of Thuy Trang and how that would go on to impact the team. It's the first time PR needed to find a way to blend the tragedy of having lost their Yellow Ranger back in 2001 with the in-show reality of Trini no longer able to be there. But instead of trying to skirt around it, or maybe throw in a relevant scene or two, this idea and the emotional turbulence that it produces is built into nearly every plot element of the nearly hour-long special we got here. And I think we got a better special specifically because they chose to face up to it and allow it to inform the various actions and motivations of many of the characters present, Min Kwan most of all, and I'll have plenty to say about her in due course. But even still, there was a risk here. You'd expect an anniversary event like this to handle things tastefully, and I think they did. But even then, earlier script drafts that thankfully did not survive the final cuts paint a grimmer picture to that end. That isn't especially surprising since PR doesn't have the greatest track record in the world with addressing serious matters, especially within the confines of recent seasons that have routinely dug holes for themselves they failed to climb out of. But I've already talked all of your ears off about my mixed feelings over these last 3 years of Rangers, so I'll spare you the retread. But my point here is the one thing I really wanted more than anything else out of this special is to not have narrative elements thrown at us that they would surely misfire on. And they managed that, showcasing both great restraint here as well as respect. And I have to believe that David Yost and Walter Jones both helping supervise the script, in addition to Jackie Marchand being credited, though I can't say the level of her involvement overall, proved exceptionally important in creating a special that didn't just look the part, but acted the part, and didn't stumble and bumble to the finish line along the way. And they so easily could have with the idea of Zach as a former politician, but because they wisely don't dig into that, I ended up liking what it implies about Zach, notable for being among the 3 Rangers sent to the peace conference. I've talked before about this conference, specifically as it pertains to Jason, because I like the idea behind him returning to Angel Grove and seeing a world that hasn't really changed that much. And one could argue that he's become a bit disillusioned with how much he can do without a power coin, an idea Forever Red carries further, with Jason as the OG Red that just sort of rolls in without as much gusto or sense of urgency relative to the others. But with Zach now back, and in black, what I see is the other side of the conference coin, pun intended. Regardless of what his work as a congressman actually involved, I think the angle here was to say that he managed to take the lessons learned from the peace conference to heart and used his professional life to find ways to assist communities from the ground up. The battle isn't over, but with Jason sort of leaning out of the implications of his initial go-getter Ranger attitude, and Tommy slowly becoming more and more Zordon adjacent before going on to mentor his own team, Zach's role, prior to becoming Min's guardian, was to find a different way to fight said battle. Hard to say how much he actually succeeded or how much of a difference he made, but I think it's more than enough that we have that as a natural extension of where he went compared to where he is now. And that's a legacy element Hasbro actually does tend to get right a lot more than not. Now, Billy's past is a bit more involved by comparison because he lasted much longer on the show, and his exit took him to a completely different planet. As far as this special goes, we're given very little indication as to how all of these various pieces fell into place and led to Billy returning home, establishing a successful company, and reconstructing the command center as a means of trying to bring Zordon back. But most of that isn't terribly important to the core of this particular story anyway, save the very last part. Because the crux of this plot revolves around the fact that Billy unintentionally brought Rita back by trying to un-Z-Wave Zordon, a mistake that also cost him Alpha 8. That's why Rita is now rocking the robot body. So similar to Zed being back in Dino Fury, the writing sort of jerry-rigs a means to bring her back without technically undoing what InSpace's Z-Wave was meant to do. That said, I would argue it works a bit better here. Not just because it's Billy having to grapple with a mistake that ends up leading to Trini's demise in story, but also because I appreciate the idea that the Z-Wave couldn't necessarily destroy evil, but only dispel it. Just like how the Z-Wave didn't stop Ranger enemies from continually flooding the streets of various cities and planets in the years that followed, it also couldn't rid itself completely of the evil it directly struck down. PR has always leaned into that idea, in some seasons more intentionally than others, and it's neat to see it incorporated into yet another anniversary special. Granted, that also completely obliterated any hopes I had for a Mystic Mother return way back when Once and Always was just announced, but I think Robo Rita ended up being conceptually stronger than I would have anticipated anyway, so no big loss there. Let's now hone in on what Billy has to grapple with in this special. I like the idea that Billy, on some level, assumes that he can use his massive intellect to undo what Zordon did to himself, only to realize just how vastly incomprehensible and unpredictable the energy he's messing with can be. Although, I would have liked it a lot more if his initial failure created a bit more introspection about the process and the motivation, not just the related end result. It would have tracked well to have him far more hesitant to attempt messing with that type of energy a second time, even if it just so happens to work, because yes, Zordon's energy is still out there somewhere, but so is that of Divatox, and everyone else who fell in Countdown to Destruction. And in a special predicated on Rita really wanting to bring back the good old days as a means of rewriting established history, it would have worked wonders to have Billy at least flirt with the idea of letting go of that past versus present internal tug of war. After all, he might not be able to ever bring Zordon back, let alone Trini. But we all know what he can do in the now. But that aside, overall, I really enjoyed this interpretation of Billy. He's got a lot more going on inside that head of his than techno jargon this go round, as he tries to make sense of everything by way of his quiet confidence and knack for planning. And I love the rather silly and slapdash nature of an otherwise technical plan, since it felt more like a true-to-form extended MMPR episode in that way. Except that since Billy here knows better now, he doesn't really explain things in a way that demands translating anymore. The other returning Rangers don't play as critical a role to proceedings, but it's still nice to see them all, even though the idea behind SPA feels pretty tacked on. There's a better than zero chance that Cosmic Fury will maybe attempt to carry on some of those lingering ideas, if only because it's the exact kind of thing Hasbro would do, so we'll see. But the heart of this story undeniably rests inside the newcomer in Min Quan, and I gotta tell you, I think she's the best part of this special. Maybe not as personally meaningful to me as having Billy back and appreciating how an older, wiser version of him seeks to work through the current state of affairs. And I have nothing but love for the idea of him and Zack as the de facto co-pilots of this once and always lineup. That having been said, I think Min's overall role and progression in the story will definitely be more divisive for some, and not without reason, but for me, she's the element that ends up elevating what we got here. Min is a character that is destined to inherit great power, and the great responsibility that comes with it, but also has overly aggressive tendencies and coping mechanisms more hardwired into her than anything Billy has built. She's basically Cora Light, but through the writing lens of Izzy Garcia, which is shorthand for there was no way I wasn't going to at least appreciate the idea behind Min, if not outright enjoy it. It's also not something PR always gets right, but there's something to be said for allowing a character to be so caught up in her web of complicated feelings that she does active harm to those who genuinely care for her. Not because she wants to hurt them, but because she's felt this tangible, palpable frustration throughout her life, likely even before her mother was killed, since Trini raised her alone, adding another layer of subtext on how she views Zack and Billy, her makeshift father figures. She's a lot more than the embodiment of wanting to floss her teeth with the spines of her enemies, though her bloodthirsty side is wildly entertaining. She's a kid who doesn't have a good outlet for everything she's been going through beyond training herself physically, and what's more, the writing doesn't reward her for acting in this way. She's continually placing herself and others into precarious positions before lashing out again to avoid the more direct pain of perhaps not being able to live up to the legacy of the mother she regards so highly. None of us came into this special assuming she wouldn't eventually be deemed worthy of those powers and don the yellow. But I think what really sold me on that was the lead up to and the aftermath of the moment of truth, more so than the moment itself. Because it would have been pretty easy, and pretty in line with what we've seen out of a lot of Ranger seasons, to simply lean on Min's one act of selfless sacrifice as a means of absolving her, and then maybe a quick apology before the credits roll in. But the writing takes the time to allow her to tussle with some of those coping mechanisms, including straight up asking if Zack regrets taking her in, a thought that likely made the rounds inside her head pretty frequently. Between that and her acceptance of how much her words and attitude must have hurt Billy later on, we see a character who doesn't just change, but actively grows. Min is a character who is able to not just come to terms with her own behavior, but gain enough emotional wherewithal to understand how her actions can and have impacted other people, especially negatively. And she'll continue to struggle with that from time to time. The path she's on is rarely linear, but I think more so than a great deal of Screwed the Pooch Rangers we've seen, her plight comes from a far more honest place. A place this special heavily invested in, despite knowing that Min would immediately rub some people the wrong way. And even if I hadn't liked what we got from her, I would still have to respect the courage to do that in an anniversary special meant to build our old heroes up. But even our heroes, old and new, have flaws, cracks, if you will. They're just doing the best they can with what and who they have. To wrap things up, I'd like to throw in a couple more details about this special that came to mind as I watched it. I kind of like the halfway house this special was filming-wise, as it shot both like a modern Power Rangers episode and like a standard Netflix series all at once. But the shot composition never felt jarring when comparing the action scenes to the quieter character moments, so it never felt like I was watching two different specials. Which doesn't sound like much, but what Charlie Haskell had to do here was very much unlike anything PR would have asked him to do previously, even though he knows this franchise extremely well and is one of the franchise's most notable directors. So kudos to all involved for making that work visually when it so easily could have not. This part is a bit more incidental, but I like that this special captured some notable elements from previous PR movies. We get the classic and much appreciated cheesiness that was on full display in the first Power Rangers movie. We get a next step adventure for these characters a la the Turbo movie, while having to drag a child along all the while. And even the 2017 movie feels kind of seen in all this. Not because of Rita's insistence on bullying Yellow Rangers, though that coincidence is funny, but because more so than the first two films, this special feels far more keen on going into the emotional truths of the characters, albeit not always completely, as a means of allowing Rangering up to represent a powerful next phase of their lives, a phase where they can respond productively to their pain. They even brought back awkward, clunky CGI Megazords, though the transformation sequence they redid for this special does hit the mark. And I like the detail of the Megazord having that bit of wear and tear since, well, it's been 30 years, and the process of bringing them back was likely an imperfect one anyway. All in all, to at long last address the question you've all clearly been begging for an answer to, yes. Once and Always is good. Pretty standard fare in some respects, but also very much better than I could have anticipated in the places they really needed to get right. It's not some revelation or some new arbitrary high point for Power Rangers, because it's certainly not without its flaws, but if you like and missed these characters, they've got you covered. If you were understandably worried about how tasteful their handling of Trini would be, they've got you covered. And if you just wanted a nice little Ranger story about the ways and means we overcome grief as a thrown together family, they do pretty alright there as well. So with that, I bid you all a happy 30th anniversary, and thank you, as always, for watching.